So my name is Stine Grodal, and I'm an associate professor at Boston University. And I work on the emergence of new industries and new organizational fields with a specific focus on categorization dynamics and looking at how do categories evolve over time and what are the strategic actions that different stakeholders take within industries and fields. Well, I just feel that organizations are kind of everywhere, and we all live in organizations and interact with organizations every day. And so this makes me very curious about how do we shape organizations and how do organizations shape us and the way that we behave. And I just feel that there's so many questions that are still to be unanswered, that we've only scratched the surface of what we can understand about organizations. Well, I mean, I hope that it kind of broadens out. I mean, I think that there's been some great work done on categorization so far. I mean, we've asked a lot of questions about categories and boundaries and what does it mean to cross boundaries and how are organizations penalized if they cross boundaries. But I think that we can expand the kind of questions that we ask beyond that, beyond the categorical imperative, to say things like how are categories also manifested in many different ways? How are they manifested, for example, through materiality? How are they manifested in visuals? And how might, for example, visuals and material artifact construct categories in very different ways? And so I think that that can maybe move us beyond just looking also at categories that have very firm boundaries. For example, when you look at categorical labels, which has been the way that people have measured categories so far, it's easy to see them as distinctive. You are either a motorcycle or you are an automobile, right? But when you begin to think about that categories can be manifested in other ways, for example, through semantic networks or in textual representations or in material artifacts or through visual images, all of a sudden you begin to ask new questions about what is a category and what does it even mean to bridge a category? So I think that's one thing. Another thing is to look at categories in kind of more of an ecology of categories and how do categories actually co-evolve, how do categories compete with one another, what is the overall structure of a categorical landscape, instead of when we think about categorical evolution, scholars have tended to also just for data reasons look at one single category and track that one single category over time, whereas I think that when you think about there being multiple categories that exist in some larger categorical space, it raises a lot of interesting questions about how do categories on the one hand co-construct each other but also compete against each other. So I think there's just like a lot of things to be done by broadening up how we think about category research. I think that both perspective on bringing discursiveness and materiality into category research will bring some really interesting things. Maybe we need to, I think it's good for people to chip away at the problem from different perspectives, and that will bring us forward, right? And so I think it's difficult, let's say, to do it all in one research project, right? And so I think that there's a lot to be done on, let's say, on the discursive side, looking at semantic networks, looking at how categories might not only be elicited through these sole categorical labels, but instead to say, well, categories can actually be activated through words that are associated with categories, and they might also show us different things about categories, right? If we go to cognitive psychology, there's a lot of work that would say that category labels are this very abstracted way of thinking. And so you have, they elicit abstracted thought, and that might lead to certain consequences for the way that you perceive, other categories or categorical dynamics or categorical bridging and the penalties associated with that. Versus if you begin to think about, well, what if I, instead of invoking the word dog, I talk about, going for a walk, experiencing unconditional love. So some of the experiences that I have with dogs versus some of the more categorical hierarchies that are associated with dogs. I mean, those elicit very different kind of cognitive structures. And the question then for category researchers becomes, well, what does that then mean for our theory? Do we have different responses based on, for example, drawing on semantic networks, drawing on more contextualized experiences as a way to elicit categorical understandings, than if we draw an abstracted thought like categorical labels? So that's kind of on the semantic network side of things, right? Then if you go to the materiality, right, you can say, well, I can either tell you dog as a category label. I might show you a dog in a physical experience of a dog, or an image of a dog. And the question there becomes, do you have very different reactions based on that, right? I mean, or if you're interested in artisanal bread, right? Does it matter if I say bread, or I show you an image of a bread, or are you actually there with the bread in your hand, right? Does that elicit different kind of categorical reactions? And do we see different kind of categorical dynamics based on those different ways of experiencing categories? So I think there's a lot to be done by broadening up those different ways in which we understand categories. That I think so far has been a lot of great work has been done, but in the future we might move beyond that to broaden out the different ways in which we actually as humans experience categories in our world, which I think is way more diverse than it has been described in the literature. So I think that the authenticity literature and the categorization literature have a lot of things to say to one another, and they, in a sense, have the same intuition, right? That we have different experiences of objects, and those experiences shape the way that we evaluate them. But I also think that the two literatures can learn from one another, where I think that the authenticity literature has done a better job at capturing the way that people make meaning of things, and the different values that are attributed to different objects, them being authentic or inauthentic, and why people have those experiences. The categorization literature has so far, at least the primary part of it, been more kind of preoccupied with just saying, do you span boundaries or don't you span boundaries? It's, in a sense, not thinking about the different meanings attributed to these different categories. And so I think that they can fruitfully kind of influence each other. I think that to have a good research project, you need to start with curiosity, right? You need to be excited about something. I mean, you as a person need to look at something in the world and think, wow, that's interesting. There's something about that I don't understand, right? That's something that surprises me, something that interests me. I mean, I think research question comes not from sitting in your office and reading theories all day. It comes from the engagement with the real world, where you encounter some kind of phenomenon and that you just think it's kind of interesting. And in the beginning, you might not know why. Right? And I think that is the beginning of the exploration process of figuring out, like, what is it about this that's actually puzzling to me, and starting from that instead of starting from theory. And so for the example of nanotechnology, well, I got interested in it I randomly went with a friend to a nanotechnology networking conference, and I was sitting there and people were talking about nanotechnology being the greatest thing ever, how it's going to revolutionize the world, how in the future everybody was going to use all of these nanotechnology products, that there was an infinite amount of things we could do with nanotechnology, and this kind of fascinated me. I'm like, wow, is this really true or not, or what's the scientific foundation of this? And so I just started going to more and more of these nanotechnology conferences, and in the beginning I was more asking things that had to do with the technology. So where does this technology come from? What can it do? But I realized quickly that I was asking people questions about the technology, but they were asking me, what do you mean by nanotechnology? You ask me about this question, what is nanotech? What is nanotechnology going to do? But I don't understand what it is. And I say, but you are a nanotechnology researcher, and I'm interviewing you. You are not interviewing me, right? But this is where it came from, that they began began to question the label and what does the nanotechnology label really mean. And one of my informants even told me that I don't think that you should do a doctoral dissertation on this nanotechnology thing because it's just too diffuse, too weird, and it's too undefined. I would encourage you to do your doctoral dissertation on something else. And the same thing with my work on light tobacco, that a lot of people ask me, oh, how did you start doing that? I mean, and it was just that it was a fascinating context. I began to read about it and figuring out there was something interesting going on about these light cigarettes, and why did people think they were more healthy, even though a lot of people would say they're not any healthier. And so the question really comes from that, from the engagement. It was not that I set out to say, oh, I read a lot of theory, and from those theory I kind of derived that, producers must use categories also strategically, right? That was the theoretical contribution, but that came from an engagement and an interest in how does this market for a light cigarette, how does it actually function? I often hear this thing about qualitative research being more risky than other things, and I think, sometimes I even think it's the reverse, that it's more risky to do quantitative work because it's less distinctive. And I'd say in qualitative work, if you do a lot of interviews or ethnographic observations, or if you collect a lot of archival data, chances are there's just something interesting going on in the data. I mean, I have never seen qualitative data where nothing interesting happened. I mean, there's always something there. I mean, so in that sense, I think it's less risky. I just think that it's about learning how to publish a qualitative paper, and that takes skill. The same way as learning how to publish a quantitative paper takes a specific skill. And so if you think that, writing a qualitative paper is just about, writing an essay like I did in high school, well, then it's very risky. But if you actually are very engaged, you read a lot of qualitative paper, you learn from other people who've done qualitative research before, I think it's actually not very risky. I think that you can easily learn the tools and understand the process through which you can do qualitative research. And I also think that the great thing about qualitative research is that often it's more distinctive, right? And so you more seldomly run into this problem of saying, oh, we've seen that before, other people did that, right? Or maybe you have the same database as somebody else, right? And you're running nearly the same regression models on that particular data set. Well, you seldom run into that problem in qualitative research because our data sets are all very different. We are investigating very different things. And so chances are that the things you're able to say are more unique and more innovative and have a larger contribution on the field, right? I mean, there was a survey not long ago in AMJ where they were asking about what are the most influential papers within the last 10 years, and most of those top papers were qualitative, and that shows you kind of like the impact you can have by doing qualitative research. So I think that people shouldn't be afraid. There's just a lot to do. Still, there's so many new and open questions, and it's not as difficult and risky as a lot of people think.